Now, there's growing pressure on the social network Twitter to do more to tackle the problem of abusive and threatening tweets. The Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, today called the company's response inadequate after several prominent women reported receiving rape threats. And in the past hour, the Metropolitan Police said it had arrested a 25-year-old man on suspicion of harassment. In a moment, I'll be speaking to Twitter's head of trust and safety from their headquarters in San Francisco. But first, here's Porrick O'Brien.
I spent today in the parallel universe that is Twitter. Trolling, it turns out, covers a multitude of sins, from the funny to the stupid, to the annoying, to the misogynistic, to the criminal. Let's start with one that's stupid, annoying and misogynistic. Oliver Rawlings is a student. Mary Beard, a famous historian and broadcaster. Yesterday, he objected to her appearance on a radio show and decided to send her this tweet. "Retweet this, you filthy old I bet your is disgusting." Mary Beard retweeted the abuse, and it would seem a family friend of Mr. Rawlings follows Mary Beard. He threatened to tell Mr. Rawlings' mammy, who patently came down on Mr. Rawlings like a ton of bricks, because about 30 minutes later, he apologised profusely. Mary Beard accepted. The troll was looking decidedly sheepish. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum now. Stella Creasy, the MP leading the clean-up charge, continued getting more abuse today, like this, just this afternoon. She's been retweeting them throughout the day. Whether it was the threat of police or something else, the troll had an online crisis of conscience and started apologising. By the end of the day, he had disappeared off the face of the web. Then John Whittingdale, the chair of the Culture Select Committee, rode into the row, announcing that they'd be calling Twitter in front of the committee this autumn.
Well, I think at the moment it is plain that it is not sufficiently easy or quick to have something removed, which is unacceptable. Now, I understand that Twitter have now said that they're looking at installing some kind of button which will allow people to identify very fast that some content is unacceptable. But we'll need to see the detail of what they propose and whether that is going to be sufficient.
Yesterday, Twitter announced a new report abuse facility within tweets, but not before the whole thing had gone toxic. Not helped, for example, by the fact that a few days ago, one Twitter boss protected his tweets so people like Stella Creasy MP couldn't contact him. It felt at the time as if Twitter wasn't listening. They are now.
Porrick O'Brien reporting. Well, joining me now from our studio in San Francisco is Twitter's head of trust and safety, Del Harvey. Do you accept you've messed this up in Britain?
It's a heck of an opening. Thanks for having me here. So I think that what I would ask is, what part of this in particular are you speaking to? I think there's been a lot of misconceptions. We haven't done ourselves any favors, certainly in terms of making sure that users know about what we already have in place for them and the improvements we've been making. But in terms of things going awry, give me a little more specifics in terms of what you would be
look, the victims of this abuse, the feminist campaigner, Ms. Criado Perez, specifically tried to contact a fairly senior Twitter executive, the head of news and journalism in your organisation. He did not reply. He blocked her and closed down his account. Now, the first law of Twitter is you engage. And if you're not engaging with the people who are victims of abuse on Twitter, you're messing things up.
The details of that interaction aside, part of the reason that we have the process that we do, which is the ticketing system, which is the forms, which is the button that we introduced 3 weeks ago on iOS and mobile web, where you can report a tweet just from that button, that's to make sure that those reports get to the right place. And, in every company, different people do different things. We want to make sure that those reports get to the right team and the right people as quickly as possible so they can actually take action on it. And part of what we're working to fix and part of what we're doing with expanding how we're rolling out that report as abuse is making sure that it's really easy for users to find the process they need to use to get it to the team as quickly as possible so they don't have an experience.
It's a very convoluted form that you've got to fill in. And if you're getting rape threats every minute, you can't fill in a form for every threat. And that's what happened at the weekend. I mean, you need some sort of system that is simpler and quicker, surely. I mean, because you're a massive social network around the world. There's a huge amount of abuse, not just anti-women abuse in Britain, but I mean, there's been racist abuse and all sorts of abuse on Twitter that presumably is just kind of going unchecked.
I think there's sometimes a perception that Twitter is the Wild West, that there are no rules. There are rules. We are working on making the forums easier to use. We have the forums primarily because it's a balance between making it really easy to report content, but then also preventing others from using those forums to try to silence people who maybe they just don't agree with. Even in the current structure of the reporting process, we see a lot of accounts reported not because they were actually posting harassing content or threats or anything else, but just because they don't agree with what the other person said. So there's this balance between making it where you can just say, okay, well, this is abusive, and then making it where you actually have to provide some context around it.
Well,
but the case of the multiple attackers or the multiple accounts that you highlighted is one of the areas that we're working to try to make it so that it's not this overwhelming burden when you're already feeling overwhelmed, right? The last thing we want to do is make you feel worse.
There's this petition going around, though, that is asking you to go further and is saying, you should be looking at basically striking people off Twitter, removing people, closing accounts, and being much more, reactive to people's complaints. Are you going to sort of change your policies?
I'm not sure of the details. I'm not sure if that's the petition that I'm aware of. We actually suspend people now who engage in abuse or harassment or who post violent threats. It's something that we've done for some time. And one of the things that I'm really proud of with the team is that we've been consistently evolving our policies. We've been listening to feedback. So something that, a year ago might not have constituted something where we would suspend an account is now something that, that account will be suspended if we get that reported to us. And that's part of the reason that the feedback that we've gotten in this has been really helpful, because it does help us make sure that we're communicating what we've done and what we're doing and where we want user input.
So just briefly, I mean, it's likely you or somebody else from Twitter is going to be called before British MPs at the Culture, Media and Sport Committee. It doesn't sound like you're going to be apologising for anything.
I don't think that's the case. I mean, quite frankly, any time that someone feels we weren't responsive or feels that they weren't heard or feels as though we were insensitive to something like that, I absolutely don't ever want that to happen. And that's part of the reason that we are always trying to improve our policies and processes and make these things easier. I'm not saying that we can't do better. I'm saying that we're listening and we want your feedback on what better looks like for you.
Del Harvey, thanks very much indeed for joining us tonight. John.
Well, joining us now from West London is Toby Young, Associate Editor of The Spectator, whose tweets have been called sexist. And with me in the studio is Helen Lewis, the Deputy Editor of the new Statesman, herself the target of sexist remarks. Are you encouraged by what the executive from Twitter has just said?
Not really. I mean, Twitter has got a huge PR problem over this, I think. That's the first interview I've actually seen where you managed to flush someone out from Twitter to come and talk about this. And they are a media company, but they don't behave like one. And that's probably happened because most journalists are on Twitter. You're on Twitter, I'm on Twitter, Toby's on Twitter. We haven't really given them the scrutiny that a media organisation would get so far.
Toby Young, what did you make of what you've just heard?
Well, she wasn't very polished, but then that's one of the beauties of Twitter. It is a bit rough and ready. I think Twitter should be congratulated for having human moderators. And that's why the reporting process is so slow and cumbersome, because if it was any easier, the human moderators would quickly become overwhelmed. Facebook does have a wholly automatic reporting process, which is wholly computerized, and it's much simpler and easier to report abuse on Facebook than it is on Twitter, where you have to fill out all these forms. But the problem is that system is susceptible to abuse, because if someone's Facebook message or Facebook page gets flagged up enough times as abusive, whether it is or not, it automatically gets deleted. Twitter are trying to be responsible about this, but the problem is they just don't have the manpower to process the reports of abuse that are flooding in, which is why they have to make the reporting process so cumbersome.
And that is a genuine difficulty, isn't it? Because one of the joys of Twitter, you know, where it works, is that it's a wonderful exchange of links and of conversation.
Yeah, and they absolutely don't want to go down the route of Facebook of requiring real names and linking to real email addresses. So that is a problem. It's always going to be much more kind of rumbustious. The problem is that I've seen several examples of direct rape threats that have been, the account has not been suspended for 24, 48 hours. And that's, the first step would be simply for them to enforce the rules that they already have.
But the difficulty is that a lot of this, of the rape stuff, for example, appears, I mean, one can't judge anything because there are maybe sub judice or whatever, appears to be sort of pranksters who think it's clever to go and do that, but have no actual, what they call in the law, mens rea, to actually commit rape.
Yeah, and that's one thing we know about online abuse, is there's this idea of disinhibition, where people simply don't realise that there will be any real consequences to their actions. And actually, what I really hope is that the fact that several people have been arrested, that won't stop hardcore people who have a social problem wanting to abuse women on the internet. It might stop a silly 17-year-old who just thinks that this is something they can do for a laugh and there will be no consequences.
Toby Young, do you think people are clear of the line between sexist observation and outright abuse?
I don't think that line is particularly clear, and it's the fuzziness of that line which makes Twitter's job quite difficult. I'll give you an example. Caitlin Moran, the feminist journalist and author, recently wrote a tweet in which she said she wanted to castrate a stand-up comedian who got into a spat with her husband, who's a music critic. Now, I don't think anyone thought that she really meant that. It wasn't really a threat, but you have to have a sophisticated enough process in place to distinguish between those sorts of hyperbolic, over-the-top responses and genuine threats. And the problem is, the troll is often the person in the argument who just has less followers. If you're famous, you can get away with this sort of abuse. If you're not, you end up getting arrested and sent to prison. And Twitter has to have a sophisticated enough process in place, I think, to be able to distinguish between genuine threats and these sorts of hyperbolic, over-the-top, Wild West-style remarks.
That briefly is true.
Well, there's one big problem with this, which is that most male journalists, and no disrespect to Toby, have simultaneously said that they've had terrible abuse and why are women complaining? And you can't really hold those two thoughts in your head at the same time. That's my problem.
Helen Lewis, Toby Young, thank you both very warmly. Christian.
Thanks. The C4 News hashtag's going mad. Now, more